can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And can you and why does that look bad?
Because it's black.
And why do you think that's a nice doll?
Because she's white.
And can you give me the doll that looks like you?
I apologize in advance if I may sound militant, but I have to address a certain ignorance that many may joke around as innocent. An unfortunate predicament that tells girls who are darker than me that they must be loud, ghetto, and belligerent. That if you're dark-skinned, you must be unattractive and illiterate, but yet if you are lighter than me, you are labeled as pretty, educated, stuck up, insignificant. Another catastrophic generational schism called colorism, an age-old form of oppression that tells them that based on their complexion, it will determine whether or not they will meet rejection, and they will always be put under inspection. It basically has the nerve to say that God created them with a born defection, so they will never get the world's attention, and it twists around women's perception and ultimately makes their varying tones of skin a dividing weapon. It says, meet this standard. But you tell me, when has anyone looked in the eyes of perfection? A theory formulated on the notion that white is pure and ideal and that black is in need of a cure and has no appeal. Since when did their skin color become a contestant? Where society looks at their skin with an unfair assessment to determine if their value is even worth an investment. And the reason why I'm so invested is because too many girls feel like they're not accepted, all because of a society that's telling them that based on their melanin that compared to those girls they will never be better than, so therefore it's propelling them to keep buying what society is selling them. And yeah, we could have young girls getting information, but we can't forget to tell them that there was already a God who put them in formation. And yeah, they can slay all day, but more importantly, let's tell them that they can slay demons and devils, because it's not a surprise that anything created heavenly, the enemy will try to create enmity. He had to make something inferior in order to boost one's supremacy, spewing out lies like something must be better if it's unattractive to be ebony. And let's not forget that because of man's depravity, slave trades made darker skinned people's casualties, but if you were good enough, you were good enough to start their families. And families, don't darken the light of your child's eyes because of the shade, but get them to comprehend that it was in God's image that they were made. Cultural norms could no longer determine the fate of our daughters the day they were born. Sin has always been associated with darkness, but it's still a sin when we discriminate based on one's darkness. See, sin never had anything to do with color, but an indicator of where your heart is. And how can we say God is good but not think he is good enough to be an artist? And no matter what their skin color is, they are all examples of what true art is. So no more you're pretty for a dark-skinned girl, or assuming a girl is mixed as a compliment, but let's make it a priority to make sure every woman has confidence. So whether you are bright as light or dark as night, red, yellow, black, or white, you are made beautiful in his sight. And it's about time we saw each other in God's light.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to have you back for this amazing conversation on colorism. It is a second part conversation. So if you have not already watched the first part, you'll definitely want to go back and watch the recording, because that has a lot of information about what colorism is, what it isn't, and it'll really bring this conversation into depth if you didn't watch that. And we'll have it available for you until the end of the month. My name is Ashley McGirt Adair. My pronouns are she, her. I am the CEO and founder of the Therapy Fund Foundation, and we are excited to be able to curate conversations and bring in amazing people like Dr. Webb to have this conversation with you. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our labor and land acknowledgement. We would like to take time to express our gratitude to the 29 federally recognized tribes throughout Washington State. We also would like to recognize the Duwamish and Chinook tribes who are not recognized by the U.S. federal government but have a long history in Washington state. We acknowledge that the land on which we gather and work is the traditional territory of the indigenous peoples who have stewarded and called this land home for thousands of years, and express our gratitude for their custodianship and the land, waters, and resources that sustain us all. We are committed to learning from and supporting their ongoing struggles for sovereignty and fostering meaningful relationships based on respect, reciprocity, and mutual understanding. We also acknowledge the significant contributions and resilience of Black and African American people in shaping the history, culture, and labor force of Washington State and across the globe. From the early days of exploration to the present, they have played a vital role in building communities, advocating for justice, and enriching our diverse society. We recognize the labor of Black and African American people, both free and enslaved, who have labored on the land in industries and within institutions. Their contributions and sacrifices have been instrumental in shaping the growth and prosperity of this region. We commit ourselves to amplifying Black and African American voices, stories, and experiences, and to fostering an environment of equity, inclusion, and justice. We strive to learn from the past, engage in honest dialogue, and work towards dismantling systemic barriers that have perpetuated inequality. As we move forward, let us honor the land, labor, and cultural heritages of Black and African Americans in Washington State and across the globe, and actively support the ongoing fight for equity and justice. Together, we can create a more inclusive and equitable future for all. And I want to thank Elevate and Momentum for sharing this amazing labor and land acknowledgement with us for us to share. We have a shared vision of eliminating barriers to Black healing and working toward creating health equity for all. And I'm really excited for this partnership that we have formed. And this week, if you're not aware, is Elevate Black Wellness Week. And I have Christian Bell here to share a little bit more information about that.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Hello, everyone. My name is Christian Bell. I am the Director of Communications for Momentum Professional Strategy Partners and our Elevate Black Wellness Initiative. And I'm just so very excited to be co-hosting today for this very important conversation on colorism with the Therapy Fund Foundation, as well as just to share with our Black Wellness Week. For those who may not know, Black Wellness Week works to raise awareness around important health issues and activities in our Black communities. And this conversation, as we're talking about colorism and the impact and how we can heal that with our families, and having Dr. Webb be able to answer so many important questions, is such a great way to kick this off. So thank you again, Therapy Fund Foundation. I'm going to talk a little bit about just some of our resources page that we have. So Elevate Black Wellness has an incredible resource page. We have fact sheets, our EBWTV, which has a lot of great interviews we've done with so many awesome community members in our community. We have our blog that has articles and things to keep you updated about health activities. And we deeply encourage you, if you can, to check out our resources page. I'm also in the chat going to drop our About Us section so you can learn a little bit more. And I'm going to drop our resources guide for you all to take home some incredible resources we have available. And so now I'm going to move into our introduction of Dr. Sarah Webb. So Dr. Sarah L. Webb launched the global initiative Colorism Healing in 2013 to raise awareness and foster individual and collective healing through creative and critical work. Dr. Webb's myriad of efforts to address colorism include designing college courses, hosting an international writing contest, publishing books, teaching workshops, and mentoring students across the world from Sacramento, California to Sydney, Australia. Because of her work and the expertise on colorism, Dr. Webb has written and contributed to several academic and non-academic articles, and she's presented these at numerous conferences and has been featured on the regional NPR stations, Fox, Soul TV, the Illinois Times, Forbes.com, the Tavis Smiley radio show, MTV, TEDx, and more. So thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Webb, for being here today, and we're so excited to get started with this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. I am excited to be here as well. And I'd like to express my gratitude again for Therapy Fund Foundation and your collaborators for holding this space and for hosting this conversation and recognizing how important it is, especially amongst the Black community. And I'd like to thank everyone who attended the first session and everyone who is here present with us today. Before we get into the Q&A, the dialogue piece, I do want to remind everyone about the definition of colorism and some foundational ideas about what it is, just so that we level set. So colorism, the basic one sentence definition is that it is a system of marginalization against darker skinned people and a system that simultaneously elevates people with lighter skin tones in society. And so we talk about colorism in various parts of the culture, various parts of policy, education, social justice, healthcare, wealth inequalities, and personal self-esteem. And oftentimes we focus on the personal self-esteem piece, but I think as we enter into our conversation today, it's going to be helpful and constructive to remember that colorism, we see that pattern of hierarchy across every sector of society, not just within families, but also in the workplace and outwards in the larger community as well. So I'm excited to hear what questions you all have that are attending live, and we also have some prepared questions in case we have extra time. And so I'm not sure if we have questions already queued up, but we can dive in if anyone is ready.
Yes, so this is conversational, so we're going to open it up. We did get quite a bit of questions submitted beforehand, but if there's anyone now who wants to submit a question in the chat or turn your camera on and come on, we really want to be able to have this conversation with you.
And if it's possible to stop sharing the slides during the Q&A part, I think we can make it feel more like a community dialogue that way, perhaps.
And so if anyone is ready, or I can start with one of the questions that came in.
Yes. And I also say we can take comments as well, Ashley. So
Yes.
people might not have a specific question, but since this is a community conversation, some people just might want to share something that's on their heart or an experience that you don't typically have the space to talk about. So we can also create and hold space for that as well.
Absolutely. And so one of the questions that came in, it said, recently I have been attracting negative attention from my darker sisters. Is it possible that being darker may affect how competitive a person may be?
So I'd be curious if that person, especially if that person is attending live. So this is something that I do. I like to, and maybe it's the educator in me, I like to unpack the question itself, right? So get into peeling back the layers that are within the question, because sometimes our questions have premises, unstated premises that they're built on. So one, I'll say that there are multiple things that might contribute to perceived competitiveness. And when we look at our culture and our society, women of all races, women of all skin tones are more likely to be pitted against each other, just in general. And I think that historically speaking, there has been less opportunity for women to advance or for women to strive for a life that they are happy with, right? For various reasons, whether that be for a long time, women not being able to be breadwinners in society, or the expectation for women in particular that they meet a certain level of beauty, or that they look a certain way, or that they be quiet in public. And so I think because of that additional external pressure, that women face across the spectrum because of misogyny, because of misogynoir in particular, which is the particular hatred and stereotypes towards Black women as a whole. They are facing a lot, right? And so there might be a perceived level of scarcity. There might be a greater perception of scarcity of opportunity, a greater perception of scarcity of good attention, a greater degree of scarcity of upward social mobility, right? Or even just validation. And so I think that when we add colorism into the mix, we see that there is, because of that lack, that perceived lack already, there is clear recognition of, okay, well, we already are dealing with a smaller piece of the pie in society in general. And so any leverage, any bit of leverage or any ounce of a head start or any ounce of an additional piece of that pie, some people will fight for that, right? Especially, I think, when we talk about healing from this stuff, it also begs the question for me, have we done a good job of teaching women and teaching Black women what collaboration looks like? And sometimes our families, sometimes we as brothers and sisters and kinfolk and siblings and relatives don't really do a good job of saying, here's how, if we work together, we can get the whole pie for all of us, right? Instead of us competing for crumbs or competing for scraps, this is what it looks like when we have a united front. And so I think when it comes to something like skin tone, I don't think being darker skinned would make someone more competitive, but I do think that being darker skinned might increase the perception where there is a scarcity of opportunity, a scarcity of resources. And so an equivalent to that might be when Black people say, well, I have to work twice as hard as a white person, right? Or I have to be twice as good as a white colleague to get the same level of recognition or to get a raise. My resume has to be 3 times better than a white man, for example, especially if you're a Black woman. And so I think when you look at the inequality, when you look at, statistically speaking, when you look at the well-documented biases and favoritism towards lighter skinned people, I think a lot of dark skinned women also see that, right? They also recognize that skin tone has been proven to give people an unfair advantage, an advantage even when they aren't necessarily more qualified or necessarily the better leader or the better equipped person to have the opportunity. And so there might be some tension. But this question comes up a lot. And I think part of it comes, or part of the negativity is when our lighter skinned siblings don't acknowledge that context, right? When our lighter skinned siblings act as if and move as if or operate as if it's a level playing field when it's really not, right? And so I think there is a lot of repair that's needed, a lot of repair that's necessary. And part of that repairing, as a dark skinned person, even I see it, is when the opportunity to say, like, hey, let me create space as a more privileged person in this space, or a more privileged person in this context, or the more privileged person in this family, when we don't see our more privileged siblings, whether it be because of gender or, disability status or skin tone, when we don't see them stepping up, when we don't see them leveraging their power in that way, it can kind of sometimes feel like a betrayal. So I think when you look at the question, does skin tone lead to a greater sense of competitiveness? I think the question would have to consider or acknowledge the fact that what is there to compete on, right? What is there to compete for? And so when you think about the documented advantages that people have for being lighter skinned, I think that it's kind of, in that context, it makes sense as to why darker skinned people are more protective of their perceived scarcity of opportunity and resources.
Thank you so much for that answer. Looks like we have a question from Malcolm Clay. What are your thoughts about other cultural parties fighting to be considered Black? For example, folks with albinism, vitiligo, Creole, etc.
So I think I need clarification on that question. Are you saying that they are fighting to be accepted as Black? I guess what I'm thinking when I hear that question is that I see all those people as being accepted as Black and being seen as Black, right? I think people with vitiligo and albinism are widely accepted as Black people, even amongst the Black community, even if they are treated differently, or even if they are disparaged or stigmatized because of a particular difference. I still think that Black people generally see a Black person with vitiligo as Black, right? And so I don't know if you want to clarify or unpack that question for me.
Yeah, there's been recent like online discourse about folks with like albinism and stuff like that being considered quote unquote Black because that one drop rule is coming back into the fray of conversations with colorism. The same with like Creole. So people, conflating race, ethnicity, and things like that in the conversation of colorism. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that in terms of how can we, differentiate race and ethnicity in the discussion of colorism.
Okay, yeah. So I find that surprising, and I think it is maybe a lack of education around race and ethnicity that people would think someone with vitiligo or albinism. I could see maybe questions around people with Creole identity, mixed race identity, but albinism in particular is not about ancestry, right? Albinism and vitiligo are about just the amount of melanin in your skin. And so you could have very obviously very clear Black lineage, right? You could be 100% African and be albino, right? Have albinism. And so I think one, there definitely needs to be greater education around like the construct of race versus the biological mechanism that is melanin, right? And so having a melanin deficiency is not in our, especially in the United States, is not part of our construct of what it means to be Black, right? Now, when you talk about people being considered Creole, I have heard this discourse about people who are mixed race, biracial, or have mixed race ancestry, and the question, the conversation around, do we consider them Black? Do they consider themselves Black, or do they consider themselves mixed race or mixed with Black, right? In the various ways that people want to create those categories or use those categories. And so one, I'll just say for anyone watching is that albinism and vitiligo are not tied to or connected to race in any way. People of any race, people of any skin tone can have albinism or vitiligo, right? And so I think that has to be like separate from the conversation. Although they receive stigma because of their conditions, because of their skin conditions and things like that, within their various racial groups, right? But like a white person with albinism is also stigmatized amongst white people, but their identity or their race as white is still known and understood, right? And so I think I just want to clarify that. Now, when we talk about different groups and how we consider or who we consider to be Black, I even think about the Soledad O'Brien documentary, Who Was Black in America? I don't know if anyone remembers that. That was years ago. At the very beginning of my journey with colorism healing, that came out. But a lot of people are saying, one thing I hear and that I actually disagree with is that race is phenotypical. And so if you look white, then you are racially white, right? I think that's an oversimplification of the history of race across the world. Yes, 100% physical features, skin tone, hair, facial features have been pivotal and essential in how we construct race, but it has by far not been the only element of how we construct race, right? And so one thing we can look at is how race, and especially in the United States, has been a legal construct. And so I think this has created a lot of tension as well, is that the generations who are removed from Jim Crow segregation, the generations who are removed from chattel slavery and who have not lived through Jim Crow segregation might have a hard time understanding why someone who looks like Thurgood Marshall or W.E.B. Du Bois would identify as Black, right? But even though they have much, much lighter skin than me, they would still have been moved to the back of the bus. They were still not allowed to go to certain schools. They still had to break that racial barrier in a lot of ways, right? So they were legally classified as Black, despite what they look like. And so I think we have to acknowledge, one, that race is a social construct. And so we're operating within systems that are larger than just our individual feelings, right? And so someone might say, oh, I feel Black or I don't feel Black. But if you still have a legal status as Black, you're still likely to be treated that way, right? And so even, when you think about the phenomenon of passing, right, where people who are classified legally as Black, but their physical appearance was that of a white person, that is an example of how the logic of race is illogical, right? Like race is not a logical system. It really implodes and crumbles under the weight of its own absurdity, right? It doesn't really make sense as a system. And so when we think about that question of who is Black, I think it's helpful to be transparent about what framework you're coming from, right? And so if you're thinking about the US context and why Nella Larson, who was biracial, is considered an African-American author or a Black author, it's because in that context, your legal status had a lot to do with who was actually classified as Black. And so I think also we have to be willing to evolve our ideas around race. I also don't think, so as I'm saying that, I also don't think we have to be beholden to the past definitions of race. I don't think we have to subscribe to what essentially white men created as a legal construct. And so I'm all for interrogating the way race has been constructed for us and taking some of that power and agency back as Black people and saying, for most of the history of the world, it has been colonizers, white colonizers, who've gotten to control the discourse around race and who was what race. And so I think it's very healthy, even though it might be uncomfortable, even though it might be complicated and, a little experimental right now. I think it's healthy for us as Black people to say, well, do I accept that definition of race, that one drop rule? Is that something that still makes sense given our current context? And even if it still makes sense, I'm not going to just accept it because it's the way it's always been. I'm going to accept it because I've actually thought through the process and that logic makes sense to me. So yeah, I single-handedly don't have the final answer on who is considered Black or not, but that's my perspective.
Thank you for that. I do see a hand from Shavana, if you want to come on.
I hope you can hear me clearly and there's not too much background noise. Perfect. Well, I really don't have a question, but more a comment. I'm grateful for this conversation. I'm grateful to be in this space. I have two granddaughters, and as they are growing, and one is mixed race and one is not, my I guess wounds have become more apparent in I want to be aware and consistently there are my loves and my legacy. So pouring into them as individuals and loving on them and just reinforcing every beautiful aspect of them. I find myself not only aware, but also sometimes overcompensating or maybe hurting if I see here, just being hyper aware of if a compliment goes to one and doesn't go to the other, if I have them in presence, or just being so hyper aware and on alert about protecting the one who's not mixed race from wounds, which I realize is my own wound resurfacing. So I'm just glad we're having these conversations and just glad to be in space and just excited about even just growing more and facing my own healing. That's all.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
And I see from Christian, as well as I got a couple messages about how do we heal from colorism? Where should the healing start? I feel we as a people don't acknowledge each other. We are broken in so many ways. That was a comment that I got. So if we could start there and maybe share some ways we can actually heal from colorism.
Yeah. So I have to plug part one. Part one, I gave the 3 A's of awareness, attitudes, and action. And so people don't like the simple answers, but conversations like this is how we start. So we're already starting, everyone, by showing up here today, by having the courage to get a little uncomfortable perhaps and engage and lean in and listen and share when appropriate. That is how we start, right? You can't heal a wound that you won't even look at. So you have to at least be willing to look at the wound first in order to heal it. And then I think the self-audit piece is a great next step. So self-auditing, kind of like the sister who shared, being able to look at yourself first in these conversations, whether it be not only how I have been hurt personally, but how have I perpetuated personally? How have I been complicit personally? How have I harbored prejudice and bias personally? How have I caused harm to another because of this communal wound that we're all experiencing some version of? And I think the attitudes, as I mentioned in part one, we can shift and adjust our attitudes by taking certain actions, such as changing what we watch, um, changing the conversations that we have with people, turning certain things off, turning the dial down on certain messages, certain forms of propaganda, listening to more of the good stuff, more of the positive stuff, exposing ourselves to a greater array of people, a greater range of folks. I'll also share too, because this kind of speaks to some of the other content that has come up, is being willing to say, like, there can be more than one thing can be true at the same time, right? And acknowledging that I have a right to feel my feelings and that the next person has a right to feel their feelings as well. And yet there's still some basic foundational facts, right? And I think my approach to colorism has always been born of my context and my background of having a lighter skinned sister and a lighter skinned mom that I'm extremely close to and best friends with, and who have rocked with me and rode for me for my entire life. But I also am aware that there are a lot of dark skinned people who don't have that experience, and they've never had a good relationship with a light skinned person ever, right? And vice versa, my light-skinned sister has me as a sibling who rides for her and rocks with her my entire life. And so she's been exposed to love and care and acceptance from dark-skinned women her entire life. And at the same time, we can acknowledge that there are a lot of light-skinned women who've never had that experience, who've never known that acceptance from a dark-skinned person. And so I think considering that, right, considering from whence a person has come, as my mom used to always say, can also help us have compassion for each other. And then lastly, I'll say that the self-compassion piece as well. So if you do that self-audit, you do that self-reflection, and you realize, like, oh, I've been mean. I've ignored someone because of an unconscious bias about their skin tone, or I used to date in a certain way because of what I was taught. To have that self-compassion and understand why you did that, because you live in a society that tells you white is right, right? You live in a society that tells you we have to aspire and assimilate and mimic white culture and white appearance and white inflection. And so I think those are some basic foundational things. And I also just acknowledge that if we've had certain habits for decades, we're not gonna undo those habits overnight. And so again, giving ourselves grace and patience.
So I saw a hand from Mary Williams and then Angela.
Yes.
Hi. So I definitely, well, first of all, I'll come on camera. So I'm a very fairly light-skinned woman, as you can see. And I was just gonna speak to the piece about the healing. And for me, what's been the most healing is my family, my Black family. And so the reality for me is, I remember hearing about things, my dad sharing things with me about when he was growing up, how they were all different colors. And, they questioned his mom about, is everybody, from the same father and things like that. And how his grandmother used to preference certain children and stuff like that. But my parents, I feel like, always made an effort to, uh, uh, neutralize that kind of thing. And then the ability for me to have access to my dad's side of the family, and being able to go down to Mississippi and be with my family, and just how they treated me has been the most healing. As I become a woman and fully, identifying as a Black woman, my mom's side of the family has really ostracized me. And especially when my parents began aging and then died, the reaction to the different, just the fact of being a full grown woman now, the ways that the different sides of the family reacted was puzzling. But definitely the most healing has always come from my Black family and just the ways that they always have empowered me. And I feel like a lot of people don't even get to know their Black family sometimes. You know, if they're only around the white side of their family, it seems just to be really sad. And I often, you know, just try and reach out. And so that's what I try and do, is just be real intentional about acknowledging all my sisters. Whenever I see people of color in my space, I always reach out and try and be very intentional about making those connections. And at work, I always will, you know, make sure that I have a good, you know, rapport with whatever other sisters or brothers is in my circle. And I just try to be really intentional about that. But the healing came from the Black side of my family. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I really appreciate that advice, that bit of guidance on how, if I can summarize some of what you're saying, is be willing to be that welcoming space for other Black people, regardless of what their skin tone is. I think we as Black people have to be proactive about making other Black people feel welcomed, right? Whether it be Black children, Black men, Black women, Black queer folks, Black people with albinism, right? I think as Black people, we already know how hard it is to find acceptance in the world. And so if you can be that one who says hello, if you could be that one who says, come sit at our table, if you can be that one who says, did you get something to eat? Can I offer you a drink? Or just, you know, like I mentioned, I might have mentioned this in part one, how like being at work with other Black people and not knowing if they're going to try to ignore you, right? Or, you know, so I really like that conversation that you started there about just be willing to be that person that where other Black people feel welcomed and seen.
Angela up next.
Good morning. Thank you for this. I really appreciate this discussion. I'm sorry I can't come on camera. I look a mess. My question is, I'm a woman that has 2 kids. One is fairer skin and one is darker skin. And we always have these discussions about color. Being that I'm fairer skin, I don't want to say I don't recognize, well, let me say I recognize my advantages in the world, but I tell my daughter that's a little bit darker skin that she still has some advantages. It may not be the same, but they're there. But we talk about the theme of reverse colorism, or colorism in reverse, where sometimes they jump on me because of my fair skin, and they really want to make it known that I have this power. And I explain to them that I don't have power. I may have advantage, but I do not have power. Can you comment to that? And I'm sorry, I'm all over the place, but can you kind of comment to that? Some of maybe the themes that you've heard or you've experienced in the past?
Yes. Yes, thank you for sharing that. And I think that example of siblings and children in a family, in an immediate family that have different skin tones is so common amongst many families. And so I'm sure a lot of people can relate to what you're saying. So I think with the one, and I say this with all from a place of love, is that you have power because all humans have power. It's kind of like what you tell your daughter. You tell your daughter that she still has some advantage, even though she's darker skinned. So I think that conversation that you have with her is also a conversation you can have with yourself. That just because I don't have all the advantages doesn't mean I don't have any. And just because I don't have all the power doesn't mean I don't have any. And I think Black people in general, across the skin tone spectrum, I think we could do better as Black people in recognizing the forms of power we do have, right? Because that's was it Toni Morrison who said one of the greatest ways people give away their power is by believing they don't have any. And so I would kind of gently push back and saying, like, what difference could it make, not just to you, but to everyone listening, if we do start to look for the ways that we have power, right? Because what that can do is, for example, I'll use, the idea of intersectionality. I'm Black, I'm a woman, I'm dark skinned, I have natural Afro hair, right? All things that are stigmatized or have been historically stigmatized and judged and marginalized in a lot of ways. But I'm also skinny, I'm also straight, I'm also able-bodied, right? And so that gives me power in certain situations to where if there's a queer, disabled sister or brother in the room with me, how can I make sure people aren't talking over them in that moment, right? How can I make sure if someone else is telling a joke about them that I shut it down, right? How can I use my power as the straight cishet person who's able-bodied in that space, who doesn't have to endure that stigma, who doesn't have to endure that public shaming or that historical legacy of ridicule and ostracization. I've never had to endure that because of my ability status or because of my sexuality. And so that gives me power in certain rooms when I am with siblings and relatives and friends who are queer or who are disabled, right? And so I think as we think about how we heal individually, but also how that communal healing, that family healing, that community healing is for all of us, again, to do that audit of not just how I've been hurt, but where do I have an opportunity to speak up in certain situations? Where do I have an opportunity to open up the door for people who have largely been kept out of that door? But I also acknowledge like where you're coming from. And a lot of times we might not have the high level systemic power, right? We might not be president or CEO of a company, but we might have micro forms of power that could still make a huge difference. And so I think that speaks, to everyone who's on this call and everyone who might watch the recording, but also speaking directly to having those conversations amongst children and amongst kids is like helping them to understand intersectionality as early as possible and not stigmatizing privilege, not making privilege and power bad words, because everyone has some. Every person who can hear me, every person who's watching this, every person who has an internet connection to be on the Zoom call, everyone who has a device to watch this, everyone who, is a citizen of the country that they live in, everyone, you know what I mean? Like there's always some version of power that you have. There's always some version of privilege that you have in society. And so not helping kids, but also helping ourselves as adults understand I'm not a bad person if I have more privilege than other people in this particular room. I'm not a bad person if I live in a society that thinks being skinny is better, right? I am a person who needs to be responsible with that, right? And so I think that's the difference. Is it's not you're not bad because you are a certain race or color or sexuality, but where we start to want to abuse that power or fail to leverage that power in service to equality for all people, right? And so I think that is maybe a helpful way or a constructive way to say, like in some spaces, in some rooms, you will have more power than other people in that room. You will have more privilege than other people in that room, but you don't have to be ashamed of that because you didn't create the system. You didn't create that social hierarchy. But what we need from each other is, how am I going to be responsible with that power that I didn't ask for? How am I going to be responsible with that privilege that I didn't ask for? And I think that would help our children get along, but also help us in our own healing journeys as well.
Oh my God. Thank you. I love that. I love real quickly that you brought in intersectionality and empowering ourselves with that, with understanding of intersectionality, understanding that we have powers in different systems. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm gonna pivot to the chat really quickly and address a couple things in here. So I've got a comment from Houston who said, where is the line drawn regarding the difference between colorism and bullying as it applies to dark-skinned people terrorizing and/or ostracizing light-skinned Black people? In part one, we talked about the benefits of being light-skinned, but we failed to point out that the benefits of being light-skinned were determined by Europeans. Even though light-skinned people were in the house instead of the field, it did not stop them from being raped and sold. I don't know if you want to elaborate any more, if you're on, or.
Yeah, I'm here. So to elaborate, we talked about the societal benefits that European influence and all of the history of America has leveraged on behalf of fair-skinned individuals. But I feel we failed to point out that while being light does afford us benefits, it has historically afforded us benefits over the darker skinned brethren and sisters, we still are Black. we still are killed disproportionately. We still are overlooked for things. But not just as it applies to our interactions with white people or other folks, but even within our own communities. I grew up with mostly dark-skinned people around me, and most of my fistfights were because, oh, I'm the light bright, so I must be weak, I must be girly, I must be this, I must be that, which none of it is true. But it didn't stop them from taking all of those learned behaviors and subconscious self-hatred and lashing out on me as if I'm the one who did something to them. And so while I noticed in part one, we talked a lot about bullying, but where do we draw the line? Where is it no longer just bullying, but an additional level of colorism as it applies to, because there are benefits to being darker over lighter skin folks, depending on which sect of society you're in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So obviously, since the day I started talking about colorism, this has been a question, right? Over 12 years ago at this point. So I'm very, very used to the question, and I have spoken about it over the years. So I'll say, one thing I've been emphasizing more, which again is one of the uncomfortable parts of our history, is that the advantages historically have not just been doled out by white people, but we also have a history of light-skinned people intentionally hoarding that wealth and intentionally using the advantages that they've gotten from the larger society against their darker skinned counterparts, right? We have seen coalitions of lighter skinned people, of mixed race people throughout history wanting to attain that higher level of status over other Black people. And it's been explicitly stated throughout history, right? And so we have to acknowledge that as we talk about the ways that darker skinned people react and respond in certain situations, is that a lot of times it's framed as if, well, light skinned people have just been innocent bystanders this whole time in every context, in every situation throughout history. That's not actually the case, right? There's like really documented history, whether you call it blue vein societies, brown paper bag tests, HBCUs, sororities, fraternities, other social organizations that were explicitly trying to hoard social status and economic capital and upward social mobility for people who were of mixed race ancestry or lighter skin tones, right? Or when you add in featureism and texturism, it escalates even beyond that. So a lot of light-skinned people have actively participated and actively leveraged colorism in their behalf, right? But I also think there's a difference between experiencing racism because you're Black and experiencing something because you're light-skinned. And so, yes, light-skinned people are still Black. Light-skinned people still get pulled over by the cops. They still get profiled. They still are less likely to be hired for the jobs relative to their white counterparts or non-Black counterparts. And I don't think that the conversation around colorism negates that in any way, right? I think you can experience racism and be disadvantaged because of racism and still simultaneously be experiencing privilege because of colorism, right? Just like you can be experiencing racism and be privileged because of sexism as a man, right? And when we talk about the backlash or the acting out or the retaliation or the ways that dark-skinned people have taken their anger and their hurt out on other light-skinned people, again, in some instances, not every case, but in some instances, they have actually been hurt by light-skinned people. So it's not always this high in the sky, abstract, I'm just randomly like acting out towards light-skinned people. And I say that, and I know, again, it's not something people want to hear, but if we're actually going to deal with that, what I'm saying has to absolutely be acknowledged, right? What I'm talking about actually has to be part of the conversation. And to the degree that our light-skinned siblings act as if the bad attention or the aggression exists for no reason, out of nowhere, just randomly, dark-skinned people just woke up one day for no reason at all, I don't understand where this is coming from, then it's a stumbling block to actually healing the situation, you know? If someone is saying, well, I don't feel comfortable around white people and I'm angry at white people and I'm gonna cuss out white folks, and you're like, well, I don't know why these Black people are so angry at white folks. I don't know why they're wanting to get revenge out on white folks. Those white folks didn't enslave your ancestors, right? Like the people who enslaved your ancestors are long gone. Why are you taking it out on innocent white people who have nothing to do with your oppression, right? And we understand that when it comes to race, how there is historical pain. So I think what I always try to say to light-skinned relatives, light-skinned members of the Black community, is that it is hard to trust light-skinned people when they don't stand in the fact that there's a history and a legacy, not just of receiving privilege from the larger society, but of mass groups of light-skinned people also throwing dark-skinned people under the bus, right? For the sake of upward social mobility. I'll also say too that there is conversation around how you as a dark-skinned person have to heal and do your work so that you aren't attacking people who didn't create the problem either, right? So to the degree that light-skinned people have benefited or intentionally tried to play the game of colorism, I call it jockeying for position in a race you'll never win, is that ultimately none of us created the system. And I often, people hear me talking like this and they think I'm letting dark-skinned people off the hook for being mean or for bullying or for fighting. And so at the same time that I'm asking my light-skinned siblings to do the work, I would ask my dark-skinned siblings to also do their work and to also do their healing and to say, even if this light-skinned person is bullying me, even if this light-skinned person is taunting me or leaving me out, I don't have to retaliate in kind. And so there does need to be healing on both sides so that we don't take out or cause further harm or create further aggression. And I think that when sometimes we have to do that healing separately. Sometimes a light-skinned person has been so hurt by the retaliation of dark-skinned people, and sometimes dark-skinned people have been so hurt by the complicity of light-skinned people in their oppression that it's hard to start the healing together. It's hard to start the healing in the same space. So I also want to say that if you feel like you can't be at peace with your siblings, your relatives, your community of a different skin tone, then it's okay to allow yourself the space to heal before you engage. It's okay to allow yourself to go to therapy for a few years before you call up that cousin who used to taunt you. It's okay to, do whatever your healing process is before you try to bring that conversation forward. And so I think to your point, like in acknowledging and not, and feeling empathy and compassion for the ways that you have had to deal with that for you and all of our siblings of on the lighter skin tone spectrum. And also knowing, and again, I'm saying this with all love and respect, that if our lighter skin siblings continue to diminish or continue to underplay or downplay your privilege in society, you make it harder to repair the relationships between lighter skinned people and darker skinned people. And so that sense of, well, it's hard for me to engage in that sense of repair and restoration when there's not an acknowledgement of that real historical context, that real historical legacy that is ongoing and that is constant. And at the same time, like in my transparency and honesty, just like I tell people about like being angry and wanting to embrace anger, is for my dark-skinned people listening who, well, I don't know if it's usually a lot of times the fighting and stuff people talk about in childhood, but pass this on to younger people that's also not your path to healing, right? And so what can we do as therapists, as mental health professionals to develop and teach and instill in darker skinned people, one, the understanding of what's happening so that they don't just resort or default to what comes easiest to them or what seems like the path of least resistance in terms of dealing with that anger and hurt, but also how can we do a better job of showing them like, here's a healthy way to cope with this. Here's a constructive way to cope with this that one, not only doesn't do harm to someone else, but then doesn't do harm to yourself as well. So yeah, that's the not easy, not simple, not popular response that I have to that larger conversation.
Thank you so much. I wanted to be able to get to a couple more, but being respectful of everyone's time, we probably need a part 3. So I'll have to reach out to Dr. Webb and see if we can get you in person or we schedule something. I did also drop her website in the link. She does have other offerings, so feel free to engage with her. But I want to invite Yaz for our final question of the day.
Yes, hi, thank you. So my question is, do you think that the celebrity culture promotes colorism? For example, with music artists saying they need like a red bone and featuring lighter skinned women in their videos as the beauty standard, as well as songs like Yellow Bone or Brown Skin Girl, and Tupac saying the darker the flesh, the deeper the roots, and how we've seen some celebrities who have been darker skinned over time become lighter. Do you think that impacts, and what kind of message does that give to the Black community?
Yeah, that's a good question because we can't underestimate or downplay the disproportionate influence that media has, right? We just live in a reality in a time now where media is just a juggernaut, right? It's like it has a monopoly of attention. But I will say it's important to just remind people, and I know you all already know this, but colorism existed long before celebrity culture, right? And so colorism was already entrenched in society. And this is what people say too, is that media, social media, whether it be movies, TV, they are really mirrors, right, of things that have already existed pre-television, pre-radio, social media. Everything that's coming out and being more prevalent, and maybe we have more access and more exposure to it, and there are platforms that amplify what's happening. They have definitely existed even before celebrity culture. But I think because celebrity culture is inherently meant to sell us a dream, I think it is more vulnerable to perpetuating things like colorism or just oppressive beauty standards, because the very premise of celebrity culture is, well, these are the special people. These are the valuable people. These are the winners in society. These are the ones you should look up to. And everyone else is a nobody, right? So it just kind of enhances that. And I think as media, because we're not going backwards, y'all. It's only going to get more with AI and people being able to design celebrities, right? You don't even have to wait for a human to be born. You could just design your ideal celebrity, right? And make them the next, I'm not going to say the next Beyonce, but y'all know what I'm talking about. And so we have to acknowledge that when we're creating technology, when we're creating media, we're bringing all of our biases with us. And I even talk about, it's not just in the industry, it's also us as fans of these industries. And so we talk about like, oh, they don't play, dark-skinned female rappers on the radio, but also will the fans listen? Will the fans support? Will the fans follow dark-skinned people as well? And so I think, yes, there's absolutely colorism in the media, colorism amongst media makers, but where, again, we have power, we have to look at where is our power, even if we're not a gatekeeper in media. By being a consumer, being a fan of media, we also have power. And so asking ourselves, what am I doing to amplify the underrepresented? What am I doing to highlight the power and the beauty and the talent of people that the traditional gatekeepers are shutting out, right? And so I know we don't have time. We could do a whole segment just on media, but those are some initial thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Webb. Thank you, each and every one of you, for being here. And thank you to those of you who are going to tune into the recording. Please complete the survey and let us know your thoughts. We want to hear from you about what other events you would like to hear from us, thoughts about the event, how it went, any questions that maybe you had that you didn't get to. We'll see what we can do, what we can organize with Dr. Webb. And our next event that we have coming up, we've got our Lunch and Learn at the end of the month. So just head to our website, therapyfundfoundation.org/events. We can also get the direct link posted in the chat. From our team members, we're going to be providing lunch at Tabor 100, catered by Beats and Eats, where you can learn more about the work that we're doing at the Therapy Fund Foundation in an effort to eliminate barriers to Black healing. Most of you know us for providing free therapy to Black community members, but we do so much here at the Therapy Fund, and we appreciate you. We appreciate your participation. We also have our second annual conference, Reclaiming Wellness, which is happening July 26th at Green River College. Our keynote is Dr. Joy DeGrue. She is amazing. And if you cannot be there in person, it is also hybrid. So scan this code right here. And again, we appreciate you all for being here. So that is it for now. To be continued, and have a great rest of your day.
I ain't tryna be stubborn, but I could use some self-loving. I ain't gotta say nothing. They already know how I'm coming. I've been working on me. I've been loving on me. I had to learn to love myself.